Welcome back to Experts on Call. BC Notaries and first-time homebuyers is a subject. I'm Joe Leary. We're joined by John Eastwood, the president of BC Notaries. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be here.
And something I just learned in chatting with you briefly is that to be a notary in British Columbia, you must be a learned individual.
Yes, some people might be surprised to learn the educational requirements. To become a notary now in British Columbia, one has to have a master's degree in legal studies. Simon Fraser University is the one that conducts that course, as well as the requirements for continuing education. We're required to upgrade our information on a regular basis.
Now, John, you are a qualified mediator and former real estate executive in Vancouver, so I'm sure you've been to this dance many times with first-time homebuyers. How important is it to bring a real estate background to the subject of notary public?
I think it's tremendously helpful. I rely on my background quite a bit. When I did run real estate operations, I used to teach people how to write contracts, and now, of course, I'm writing a number of contracts for clients. So it's quite helpful. I'm quite knowledgeable in real estate, and I got to know a number of real estate people, which, of course, is good for my business, but also I think benefits my clients.
So you have been with many a first-time homebuyer over the course of your professional life here. When you talk to people that are prospective homeowners, what solid stage advice do you offer them? What are some of the things that they really, really need to look out for?
Well, hopefully they'll have a realtor looking after them in the beginning and dealing with the property purchase and showing of properties, drafting the contract for the people. But there are some things that they should look out for. Contract to purchase real estate should be subject to anything that has to happen before they can unconditionally commit to buy it. First and foremost, of course, buyers would be thinking of mortgaging. If there's a mortgage, then they need to be approved for that mortgage. And we regularly talk to particularly first-time home buyers who say, well, no problem, I'm pre-approved by my bank. That may be the case, but the property also must be approved by the bank. And so they probably need to make their purchase subject to arranging that mortgaging and being approved for it. As important is knowing what you're buying. I recommend to all buyers that they have a home inspection done by a qualified inspector, and their purchase should be subject to that. They should have a look at the title to the property before they unconditionally commit to make sure there's no charges on title that might adversely impact their use and their enjoyment of the property. They should get a property disclosure from the seller where the seller discloses to his knowledge the condition of the property. Many things that first-time homebuyers might want to talk to the notary about, and if they're uncertain about this, might want to make that contract to buy subject to the approval of their notary.
Well, we've learned that the notary is the last step pretty much in the acquisition of the home. Do you find that when people come to you, are they generally well-informed, or is there a fair bit of misinformation out there?
With people that aren't quite experienced in purchasing homes, they're not that well informed, and they're really looking for some guidance and looking for some help. And yes, we usually become involved later in the process after they've purchased the property. Not uncommon, though, these days to have us speak to the people about their purchase in advance. I do it with a number of first-time home buyers and offer them the opportunity of having me involved to look at the contract for them if there's any questions.
Our guest is John Eastwood. Eastwoods.ca is the website. John is the president of BC Notaries. You can reach him at 604-946-8010. You, of course, are in the Ladner South Delta area. Is this a good real estate market right now?
I think it's a wonderful market. Prices, while they're going up a bit in some areas, for the most part, aren't racing along and increasing at such a rapid pace as they were a couple of years ago. Buyers are having a little more time now to make decisions about the right property to purchase rather than having to act instantly, which has been the case in the past. There are exceptions, a couple of areas in the greater Vancouver or the Metro Vancouver area where the market is still as active as it was before, and people are having to move quite quickly. But for the most part, that's not the case. It's a better balanced market now.
John, when we hear the term first-time homebuyer, I guess the perception is a young couple looking to perhaps get out of renting an apartment and maybe buying their first condo or something like that. Is that the clientele, or is it a little bit more broad-based than that?
I think it's a bit more broad-based. Young couples with young families are generally the ones we see most. They could be moving out of rental accommodation and into their first, they are into their first home, into a strata property or a single-family house or duplex or townhouse. But for the most part, they're moving up out of rental accommodation, I would say.
Now, we also think that perhaps people can maybe downsize, and I'm sure you see some of that go on as well.
And that's the other side, right, where there are first-time home buyers. There are people selling to those first-time home buyers that are moving out, have retired, don't want children, aren't living at home, and they don't need to maintain that large house. So they may be moving down into either a smaller house or into strata title property. And when they move into strata property, they're encountering a whole new mini government in the strata corporation, and they have to be aware of that new experience. There are some rules, some restrictions on the use of the property, sometimes pets or age restrictions. So as long as they look into that and know what they're getting into, it's usually a good experience, but they should know what they're doing. I
remember I had a situation occur to me, but the first residence that I owned, it was a strata building. And I had never dealt with strata. I had heard the term strata, and I'd heard some colorful adjectives that were applied to strata. But, for example, come Christmas time, somebody next to me put a Santa on their door, which they weren't allowed to do because you own the inside of the door in. You don't own the outside of the door, which faces the hallway.
Correct. That's exposed or opening to what we call common property or limited common property. So, yes, you have to understand that there are those sorts of restrictions. And you speak of Christmas. It reminds me of Christmas trees. And some strata don't allow you to have a live Christmas tree.
Sure.
Many don't. So there's many rules. Pets seem to be a particular concern. People coming out of houses may have a pet. They should be sure that they know if they're allowed to have them. And sometimes there's even restrictions on the size of a pet you can have.
But before people come to avail themselves of your services and close on these deals, these are things that they should have done in their due diligence, or their realtor certainly should have.
Correct. And good realtors do make sure those are covered.
Right. Our guest is John Eastwood. Eastwoods.ca is the website. John has been serving the Ladner South Delta area. This is Experts on Call. We're talking about first-time home buyers. Now, we mentioned earlier in the program that regulations or legislation, I guess, was amended recently in the province of British Columbia. Have you seen any effect on that, or will it have an effect on somebody perhaps looking to acquire their first property?
Well, it will, in that it has the potential of increasing their cost, the monthly payment on a mortgage. The down payment some time ago was increased so that home buyers now require a minimum down payment of 10%. The higher the ratio of financing, usually over about 75% of the value of the property, the higher the fees that they would have to pay in order to obtain the high ratio financing. There are reinsurance fees mortgage lenders have to pay, and so the client must pay that as well. We did notice recently, just in anticipation of the changes, that all of a sudden notaries were doing more mortgage work, people wanting to get mortgages in place under the old regulations, which allowed them to have a longer amortization period and thus a lower monthly payment.
You can find out lots of information on the notaries.bc.ca website. Our guest is John Eastwood. He's the president of BC Notaries. I'm going to ask you the basic question here, John. When one acquires a property, say for the first time, are there any tax considerations or perhaps any concessions, any rebates that one can apply on their income tax?
Well, there are potentially two. Not applying on income tax. If they're purchasing their principal residence, then it isn't subject to tax, and therefore they don't have any tax write-offs as opposed to investment properties. But taxes that they may have to pay, property transfer tax, There is an exemption for first-time home buyers up to a price limit of $425,000 to $450,000. If they're purchasing a new property, then they have to be conscious that there will likely be HST payable, and that's 12% of the purchase price, so it's a significant sum of money. There are rebates available, firstly on the provincial portion and secondly on the federal portion of the HST, up to certain limits, that may be available to buyers.
Our guest is John Eastwood. You can check out the website eastwoods.ca. John is the president of the BC Notaries, and John, you've been applying this trade and this craft for some time. Do you have any particularly heartwarming stories or perhaps any nightmarish episodes that you've encountered?
Well, hopefully not, but one thing I would like to suggest to first-time homebuyers, for example, is that buying a property is at one stage, but there are other things that perhaps we could help them with that they should be looking at. Recently, the Notary Society did a survey on wills and how many people have wills. Right. Not surprisingly, those that are over 55 think more about that, and we found that about 80% of those had wills. But young people, 35 and under age group, only about half have wills. And while people are acquiring assets, such as young families acquiring their first home, they really should look at having a will as well. It gives them the ability to, first and foremost, if they have young children, determine who would be the guardians of their children if something should happen to them. And secondly, many couples are under the belief that if they should pass away, if one of them should die, the other partner would automatically inherit that estate. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Right. And through a will, people can determine who inherits their estate.
I learned some years ago that I think whenever you have stuff, whenever you acquire anything, you should probably direct where you want it to go on your passing, because again, situations can occur that when you least expect, and things can happen. So I guess that's an important little adjunct to it's certainly a vital part of the notary business. But again, when you're buying a home, because that is a substantial amount of investment that you've made. At that point in time, you should also look to perhaps addressing where you want that to go in the event of your passing.
You're absolutely correct. It's something that we like to talk to young people about. Certainly it's their choice whether or not they wish to, but I would certainly encourage them to look at that seriously and not put it off too long.
No, exactly. Now, we were talking with Akash earlier about the average client. Who, in your estimation right now, who are the most likely to be availing themselves of the services of a notary for the closing of a home? You did say it was fairly broad based, but is there a typical consumer right now?
Well, I think the average buyer right now is purchasing their first property and their home, but we also deal with people that are investing in real estate and acquiring other types of properties for rental income or for estate planning. And in estate planning, I know that people should be looking at how they own their home and whether they own it jointly with the right of survivorship with their partner, or whether they wish to own a specified interest themselves.
Is there a lot of I mentioned to you at the beginning of the segment, if you could offer a piece of sage advice to somebody, a cautionary tale, if you will, because there's no shortage of notaries throughout the province of British Columbia. What is it that you think when they're looking around to find the right fit, the right person? What should they be on the lookout for in the services of a notary public? Well,
I'd strongly encourage them to call.
Right.
Certainly ask the notary questions, make sure they're comfortable with that notary and that they feel that notary is going to do the best job for them and look after their interests. Notaries welcome calls. There is no commitment, and of course no charge, just to talk to us about what they're considering, whether it's purchase of a home, whether it's looking at their estate matters, planning estates and wills, powers of attorney, that sort of thing. We also do other areas of legal practice, such as drafting contracts or agreements between parties, leases, that sort of thing, swearing affidavits or declarations. notaries do a number of those legal services.
And as we learned off the top of this segment, they must be very intelligent people as well, and always learning more, you were telling me.
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, we do have ongoing education requirements,
right,
where we're required to actually have a certain number of hours per year, in the area of 30 hours a year that we must be taking courses. I think most notaries that are active in real estate or in estate matters are taking more courses than that, but there are certainly requirements that we be kept up to date.
The man to speak with in the Ladner South Delta area is John Eastwood. He is the president of the BC Notaries. Eastwoods.ca is the website, and the phone number is 604-946-8010. John, thank you.
My pleasure.